Just let me be a salted dog, salted dog, salted dog, let me be a salted dog.
We're in Larry's backyard, sitting next to his compost pile, because I want to talk about cats and dogs. If we want to talk about cats and dogs, what's interesting about them from an archaeological perspective, at least to me, is how they came to be domesticated. Humans inadvertently create ecological niches to which different plants and animals adapt. We then sort of adapt to these ecomorphs, as they're called, and begin to sort of deliberately create habitats for these species. Dogs are probably the first species domesticated by humans. They were domesticated more than once in several different places. It's not as though we went out and found a snarling, angry wolf in the wild and decided that we were going to take it home and make a pet out of it. It was a sort of long process that wasn't necessarily deliberate, but it's a good example of what a commensal relationship can be between two species. There are sort of different routes to animal domestication. And so the one we're talking about right now is commensal domestication, which is where humans benefit from having an animal nearby. And so dogs and cats are sort of the primal example of that. There's prey domestication. So now we're thinking about animals that we treat as food. So we raise those animals in captivity rather than hunting them. And so animals like goats and cows are sort of the key species or earliest species in which we had a sort of prey domestication thing. We corralled those animals and kept them around for when we needed to eat them. And then you have, over time, people start sort of learning that, we can do this, we can have these kinds of relationships with animals. And so you have, in the more recent past, dogs are getting domesticated 15,000 years ago. You have, goats and cows being domesticated, between 9 and 12,000 years ago. Then you have people starting to figure out how to do this on purpose. And so you have things like horses and llamas being directly domesticated, deliberately domesticated around 5,000 years ago. And then nowadays we have the kinds of domestication improvement that we sort of think of as animal breeding, where people are intentionally crossing Labradors and poodles and making Labradoodles. Humans and dogs have had a very long and evolving relationship. So, it wasn't as though 15,000 years ago things suddenly started to change between humans and wolves. And so the basic idea is over time we get used to one another and develop a partnership. So how does that happen? And things like compost come into play. In a nutshell, the reason why I'm hanging out by compost is a kitchen mitten. And so early humans are going around and living in mobile communities, and they're throwing their wastes around the edges of their settlements, and that waste is attracting wolves. And the wolves that are attracted to that waste are also the wolves that are not afraid to be near human settlements. So these are unusually curious animals. And even though two species can exist in the same territory, if they're not eating the same food, they often don't come in contact with each other. And so you have this sort of genetic disconnect between them because they sort of dine in different restaurants. And so you had wolves who were cool with eating human garbage and cool with hanging around with human communities. And then you had the wolves that were, human shy, or perhaps, too aggressive, hostile, whatever it might be, to come near a human community and eat that human food waste. So these become ecomorphs. And, there are other examples from biology about what kinds of ecomorphs are out there. Like there are, tundra and taiga wolves versus forest wolves. And, they might live in the same territory. They might, occasionally cross the same territory. But because they have these sort of ecological specializations, one is going to eat caribou and the other is going to eat, other vertebrates. If you can imagine the the wolves that are not afraid of people are going to come around and start to separate from the other wolves just by virtue of the fact that they suddenly become this sort of species that's following these migratory humans. And as humans settle down, those animals become sort of more and more part of the human milieu. And we know a lot about this stuff because of, well, a Soviet researcher named Dmitry Belyayev. And he had this thing called the Fox Farm. And this experiment started in 1959. The initial objective was, hey, if we take some foxes and we can make some that are docile and domesticated and we breed them in with the wild foxes, maybe they won't eat so many chickens. Over time, if you just select for sensitivity to humans, what they found was that as you select for these things, the gene that's linked to that curiosity or human sensitivity is also linked to the gene that gives coloration to animals. So after the 6th generation, the animals start to, being selecting for this sensitivity, the animals start showing no fear of us. By the 8th generation, they start looking different, and they start looking like domesticated dogs. They develop spots, you know, their coats change colors, but it teaches us about sort of how we got to, you know, where we are today from a genetic perspective with respect to dogs. So all of this in essence is about niche construction. Creating a compost pile is creating a niche for all of these sorts of fungi and bacteria that are breaking down the compost. And it also creates a home for things like mice. Humans are constantly creating ecological niches. And, you know, one of the first commensal species that we domesticated along with the dog that we don't often think about is the common house mouse. And it's simply an animal that sort of moved in on our garbage in the same way that dogs did. And so this is what brings me around finally to cats. So dogs and humans have this deep relationship, or at least dogs have a relationship with our food scraps going back, you know, at least 15,000, if not 38,000 years. But cats kind of show up on the scene around 5,000 years ago. And what's interesting about cats is that sort of we created a niche, the compost pile, that created another species, the house mouse, that created a niche for the domesticated cat. So on some level, the cat is sort of still a commensal species, except for those that we've brought indoors and are still directly breeding.
Just let me be your solid dog, solid dog, solid dog.
Airborne dust from feline feces can be breathed in and become an infection in human lungs. There's a number of other things.
So you think cats are parasites? It's parasitism.
That you both develop the same antibodies, okay, the same resistance, and perhaps the same behavioral traits.
Huh.
You think that mice lose their usual aversion to cat urine, right, under the influence of certain microorganisms. And likewise, people seem to suffer compromised judgment about cats, the crazy cat lady syndrome. And I throw this out with all, due respect and whatnot, but
you heard it here, cat people.
But it does stir the turds a bit.
It does. Yeah. So but please leave a comment about your feelings about is your cat a parasite?
Well, I think it's more like, do domestic animals and humans share parasites?
Solid dog, let me be a solid dog.